We know 1 out of 4 women and 1 out of 7 men and 1 out of 3 teenagers will be victims of violence in their relationship in their lifetime. We're talking about your friends, your family, your neighbors, and maybe even you.
I've never seen a battered woman. Is domestic violence even that big of an issue anymore? It's impossible for a man to experience abuse. These are all real comments that have been made by members of our community, and they highlight a fundamental misunderstanding about who experiences abuse and how common domestic violence really is. There's this prevailing narrative that domestic violence is an issue, but it's something that happens over there to someone else, not to me, my family, or anyone I know. However, the statistics show that it is highly likely that every single person knows someone that has been impacted by domestic violence. But if it's so common, why aren't we talking about it? Does it make us uncomfortable to know that our loved ones may be causing harm to another person? Or does it make us feel helpless to know that a friend is being victimized by their partner because we don't know how to support them? Either way, not talking about domestic violence is contributing to a culture of silence that only hurts victims of abuse. I'm MC Robinson, and this is Unsilenced, a JBWS podcast where we have real conversations about abuse. Today, I'm speaking with
Diane Williams. I am the president and CEO of JBWS, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker.
Diane is going to explain why domestic violence grows in silence, how isolation can prevent victims from seeking assistance, the shame that frequently accompanies abuse, and what we can do to break this culture of silence. But first, we need to understand what domestic violence is. When we say domestic violence, what exactly is it that we're talking about?
Domestic violence and intimate partner violence are used interchangeably, but they're not really the same thing. Domestic violence is really violence that occurs when people are residing together. So that could be an intimate couple, it could be parent-child, it could be siblings. So people that are residing together where there is violence could be considered domestic violence. And intimate partner violence is really violence that occurs between 2 individuals that are involved in an intimate relationship.
It's important to note that JBWS serves all people impacted by domestic violence and intimate partner violence. But sometimes the term violence itself can be misleading.
People I think are most often aware of physical violence. And I think many times it's because it's the visibility of it and what we hear about more. But there are so many other forms of violence. There's verbal abuse, there is technological abuse, there's financial abuse, emotional abuse. It takes on so many forms that I don't think most people know or really recognize that if they're experiencing those forms of abuse, that they are essentially being victimized.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good distinction because I think a lot of people immediately hear violence and they go to physical violence. So I'm wondering, like, how has our understanding as a society of abuse and all the different forms of it and who may experience it shifted over time?
I'd really like to think as a movement, we've learned so much, even in the way that we depict things visually on our brochures or the information that we share has expanded. Back 25 years ago, our logo or our literature may have included, just someone having a black eye or something like
Right.
that. And which was important because it was very impactful for people to see that. But at the same time, was it minimizing all of those other forms of abuse that people experience? And then when we do that, does that make people hesitate from stepping forward and saying, I need help because I'm not being physically injured? So I must not be a victim of domestic violence. And we've learned that that's not the case. And, many times the types of violence that happen don't start being physical violence,
Mm-hmm.
that some of those other forms of control and violence take place first. And if we're not recognizing that, it would be really hard to stop that from escalating.
If you're interested in learning more about all the different forms of abuse, please visit jbws.org/about-domestic-violence. And so when we think about JBWS and the services we offer, can you tell me a little bit about our beginning, how and why we began?
Back in 1976, JBWS was started by a group of women who saw that there were no resources in the community of Morris County for their friends, their family members, their neighbors that were experiencing domestic violence. And so they wanted to do something about it, but there really wasn't a recognition at the time that domestic violence was an issue in Morris County. And so they started that helpline and the shelter in their own homes. I mean, their helpline was ringing in their kitchen.
Mm-hmm.
And in a very short period of time, there were over 30 women that were being sheltered in those houses.
Wow.
Which made for an amazing media story. But unfortunately, after that media story broke, those houses were no longer confidential locations. And so some of those survivors had to go back to some unsafe situations because they didn't have any other options.
Mm-hmm.
In a very short period of time, there were 2 high-profile murder-suicides in Morris County, and it shook the community and really galvanized them to get behind raising the funds to open up the first shelter for JBWS and for Morris County for victims of domestic violence in 1978.
When JBWS was founded, what was the general feeling about domestic violence? Like, was it something that was well known, or was it something that was more kind of secretive?
And that secret really still is present today.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to think we have come a long way, and we have in our community about recognizing that this is an issue in our community, that it's something that we should all be aware of, that we should all be fighting against.
Yeah.
And one of the biggest barriers for survivors seeking services is the silence. It is the fact that there's so much shame that's connected to being a victim of domestic violence still today, that's really a barrier for people that are seeking services or safety.
Absolutely.
But we need to talk about the issue. Don't let the conversation stop here.
Mm-hmm.
Continue to be part of the conversation, because domestic violence grows in silence. So the more that we talk about the issue, the easier it is for people to access services and realize that support, non-judgmental support, is there for them.
Yeah, I mean, that is actually the entire premise behind the reason for this podcast. I would hear you say in these presentations that domestic violence grows in silence. And so this is intended to break that silence, increase those conversations. How does domestic violence grow in silence?
I mean, one of the biggest issues that happens with victims of domestic violence is that the person who is using abuse uses isolation as a way to control them. It starts so very slowly that it's almost hard to recognize as it's happening, at the distance that starts to get created between friends and family members. And, before you know it, a victim of domestic violence feels so isolated and alone in what they are dealing with.
Right.
And then you have the shame that kind of comes along with being a victim of domestic violence and not recognizing the prevalence of the issue. Mm-hmm. And that there's non-judgmental people there to support you. So when I say domestic violence grows in silence, it's because the more secretive it is, the less that we talk about it, the harder it is for survivors to seek services, the easier it is for people who are using abuse to continue with their behaviors, because they'll go unchecked. Mm-hmm. That people won't be, noticing. Neighbors won't be saying, "Are you okay?" Mm-hmm. That they won't be able to recognize what the signs of domestic violence are, or think that it's not their business to get involved.
Right.
And so part of what we do when we're saying domestic violence grows in silence, so let's keep the conversation going, is
Hmm.
not just about talking about and having these conversations, talk about those people. It is because when we know 1 out of 4 women and 1 out of 7 men and 1 out of 3 teenagers will be victims of violence in their relationship in their lifetime, we're talking about your friends, your family,
Hmm.
your neighbors, and maybe even you. We need to have these conversations. We need to educate ourselves about the resources in the community. We need to understand that we can intervene safely, and we can intervene with, no judgment involved, no blaming involved, just as a way to help say you're not alone. And that is so incredibly impactful for someone who's suffering in silence. But our, enhancement of our communications around social media have really increased people's ability to understand what domestic violence looks like,
Hmm.
and for them to recognize that there are resources available, even if they're not thinking of leaving or they're not ready to leave,
Right.
that there's someone available to just listen,
Mhm.
to maybe to safety plan, maybe to help them get connected to counseling, or maybe help them get connected to our abuse intervention programs if they recognize that they're the person that's using these unhealthy, controlling, abusive behaviors. But when we're talking about what does domestic violence grows in silence mean, it is because it's that silent isolation
Mhm.
that keeps the domestic violence kind of like this perfect storm of percolating, that it will continue to happen, it will continue to escalate, and there won't be some sort of relief or intervention.
Yeah. And, I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense. If people are isolated, they can't see. Maybe this isn't how every relationship goes, or maybe they grew up, if they're the person using abuse, with seeing like their parents using this behavior. So the isolation for both the person that is experiencing abuse and the person using abuse, I think contributes to this culture of silence. And I'm curious, why do you think there is this culture of silence around domestic violence? And how do you think that like interplays with the shame that we talked about?
Part of what happens in that process of being controlled or manipulated, abused, is that there is this sort of self-blame that happens when you start to hear over and over again, this is happening because of you, this is your fault, you're not good enough. You start to actually take on those beliefs, and then it becomes harder and harder to reach out to say, I need some support,
Mm.
because not only are you isolated, but you also are believing that this situation is happening because of something that you have done. And,
Mhm.
if there's something that I would really want survivors of violence or victims of violence to hear the messages, is that in no way is this your fault, that you didn't cause this, and that you don't have to continue to stay in that situation, and that there are resources that are available.
I think a lot of people might not recognize that they don't have to be ready to leave right this moment to reach out to us, or that if they say something to somebody, that doesn't mean that they have to leave then imminently. What you said was really important in regarding just conversations in general. And I'm wondering, how does having these types of conversations, like, can they really benefit people? Because you think about it, it's like, okay, yeah, we're talking about it, but how does these types of conversations help victims or people experiencing abuse right now or using abuse maybe come to realize that this isn't something that's okay?
Having someone to reach out to, it is really the opportunity to not feel by themselves in what's happening, which is so incredibly important. To have someone just be able to listen, who understands what domestic violence looks like, so that maybe they will start to feel some level of support, and maybe they're not in a situation that they want to leave or currently want to leave, but someone who can talk to them about what resources and strategies are available to them now and what is available to them in the future. Our helpline is also not just for survivors of domestic violence. It is for anyone that is impacted by the issue. So if I have a friend or a colleague or a family member that is experiencing domestic violence and I'm not sure what to do about it, I can call the helpline and I can say, this is the situation that this person that I care about is in. What can I do? How can I intervene safely? We have on our website something called our concern document. And that document, in very clear ways, goes through a step-by-step process on how to really intervene in a situation safely, so if I were to do that, I wouldn't be at risk, but also so that the person that you're talking to, their safety is not impacted by that as well. So I would encourage people that have any questions about how to intervene safely to look for our concern document on our website.
As we're having this conversation, I think, we're speaking about how important it is to break this silence. And somebody listening might think, okay, well, how can I do that? How can I start to have these conversations? Like, what is most effective? Even just a listener that happens to find this issue, they've never really heard about it, didn't really think too much about it, and now they want to know, like, okay, well, I'm ready. Like, I'm ready to break the silence. What can I do?
You go to our website, you can start educating yourself about the issue of domestic violence. So you can do that on our website. You can follow our social media by liking and sharing that information. It's like the ripples of a pond. It goes out and you say, please share this information. Because if we go back to those statistics around the prevalence of domestic violence, there's someone in your circle that's suffering in silence right now.
Wow.
You don't know it. So if you like and you share that information, you could save a life, or you can change the trajectory of safety for someone and not even know it.
And social media is one of those things that could overcome the isolation that somebody's experiencing. Maybe they can't see their friends and family, or maybe they've been restricted in other ways. A lot of times they can still access social media, or it could be something to just get in their minds of like, wow, wait, what is this? I've never heard of this, and start to see themselves and like, this is the behavior I'm experiencing. So I think, particularly social media, has such a powerful effect, or has the potential, even sharing this content. And I think this really leads to a lot of other thoughts on barriers that some victims might be experiencing to leaving. So in addition to maybe that isolation, what have you seen are barriers to seeking assistance?
There's probably going to be another podcast that talks about this. Yeah, that sounds almost like the question that people ask of why doesn't she just leave? Right. And it's that simplification of this really complicated situation and usually what I say is that, well, let's start talking about why that person continues to abuse. And because the other one is a little bit blaming. Now, what you're talking about is somebody wants to leave. What are some of the barriers that prevent them from leaving? The first thing is fear. That is typically, they've been told and believe with good reason, I will hurt you, I will kill you. They have been threatened with physical harm, or their physical harm of their family members or their pets. So there is some real fear there about, how am I going to do this safely? Because I don't want to be hurt. I don't want these other people or my pets to be hurt. Other things that prevent is lack of access to resources. How am I going to feed my children? How am I going to get my kids to school? How am I going to live? Where am I going to live? So resources are available. It's not an easy shift to make, but we help people find housing. We provide safe shelter. We help people find, new opportunities for employment and vocation. We understand that today's world is an expensive one. Our community is an expensive one to live in. So imagine for someone who's trying to reestablish themselves in the community, whether they're on their own or if they have children with them, how challenging that would be thinking about that. But support is there.
It is interesting that even with a lot of these barriers to seeking assistance, we have recently seen like a huge increase in the number of people that are seeking our services. Do you think domestic violence is getting worse?
That's a great question. And one I've been asked a lot recently because I know for us in our community, our statistics have been through the roof. So of people that are seeking safe shelter. And so what I think is it's really a combination of things, post COVID, and COVID did a number on everyone. But in particular, there is an increase in mental health issues. There's an increase in substance abuse issues, the increase in the cost of living and financial stressors. Now, all of these things do not cause domestic violence.
Right.
But they create a perfect storm and percolator for those things to thrive. And so when we're looking at why is domestic violence so bad right now, I think it is concurrently happening that pressure cooker of what's happening out there in society, in addition to us really doing a much better job of talking about the issue and communicating there are resources that are available, is having more people reach out than might have reached out before, because we are, breaking the silence.
Yeah.
Because we are having conversations, because we are out in front of them, either, physically doing presentations or tabling events in the community or on our social media. And we're saying this is an issue and resources are available, and you don't have to suffer in silence, that there are spaces and places you can go, that there are safe people, really smart people that can help you navigate that situation wherever you're at in that situation. That I think is concurrently, it's that perfect storm of percolating. And then it's also, maybe we're doing a better job of saying resources are available and breaking the silence.
Yeah. And, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but that is the overarching goal of the podcast, is to get people to reflect on their relationships and things in society that could be endorsing abuse, and really realize that it's a lot more common than we think, and to learn more about it and reach out and get help. In that same line, if people do want to help end domestic violence, how can they get involved either with us or on a national level? Let's say they don't live in New Jersey.
Find out who your local domestic violence organization is. You just Google it and you'd be able to find that there are so many ways that you can help the domestic violence organization's missions in the community.
As we start to wind down this conversation, I'm curious, in reflecting on everything that we talked about today, what is something that you wish survivors of domestic violence knew? Something that they could take away from this, or something that somebody that knows somebody that's experiencing domestic violence, what do you wish that they knew in general?
Yeah, try not to get emotional, thinking about, like, if I want somebody to walk away knowing one thing, is that you're not alone. It can be such an isolated feeling. And there is a community of people out there that care about you and that care about your situation, your family, and we're here to help, and so don't hesitate to reach out. I know it can be a little bit scary that first time, but what you're going to find is that when you call our helpline, is you're going to hear somebody that cares about your situation and is knowledgeable about how to navigate it on the other end. So, don't hesitate and reach out, and you'll be thankful that you did, because you'll realize that there's support there for you.
And I'm biased, but I think we have the best people on our staff. As this podcast goes on, you'll hear from a ton of different people in a ton of different programs and really see that they're just very compassionate, understanding, and kind people. So I definitely not alone. So is there anything important that you'd like to add that I didn't already discuss or that you would like to address?
I think that one of the things that stands out that I wanted to talk about is to really just commend you, MC, on bringing this opportunity to reach more people. Uh, and my hope is that that's what this does. It increases our reach in being able to break down that cycle, to um, make sure that we have these conversations to break the silence, so that domestic violence doesn't continue to grow. And so, thank you.
Of course, thank you so much. I hope that this episode of Unsilenced has given you a better understanding of the prevalence of domestic violence and why we must start having conversations about abuse. Thank you, Diane, for sharing your expertise and for being the first of many guests on this podcast. Each week, we will explore a topic relating to domestic violence, so please subscribe to Unsilenced, Real Conversations About Abuse. We will continue to have these raw, unfiltered conversations with survivors, people who have caused harm in their relationship, psychologists, social workers, and others impacted by domestic violence. If it is safe to do so, we hope this episode inspires you to start having conversations about abuse, because no one should have to suffer in silence. Thank you for listening to this episode of Unsilenced, Real Conversations About Abuse. This podcast is produced by JBWS, a domestic violence agency serving Morris County, New Jersey. Please let us know what topics you would like covered on this podcast by sending an email to podcast@jbws.org. Please note that this email address is only intended for content relating to the podcast. It is not meant to offer immediate assistance or access to services. If you live or work in Morris County and think you might be in an unhealthy relationship, JBWS is here to help. Please visit our website at jbws.org to learn more about our services, or call our 24-hour helpline to speak to members of our staff at 1-877-782-2873. If you recognize controlling or abusive behaviors in yourself, JBWS can also help change those behaviors. Through our Jersey Center for Nonviolence, JBWS offers programs for men, women, and adolescent males who have used abusive or controlling behaviors in their relationships. Please visit jbws.org/JCNV or call 973-539-7801 to learn more. If you don't live in Morris County, please call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. Domestic violence grows in silence, so thank you so much for listening and helping us break through that silence through these types of conversations. Please follow us on social media and continue to share our content to get as many people talking about domestic abuse as possible.